This tendency towards eros in stone can be seen even more explicitly in G.F. Watt's Clytie, which is a sort of naked back of a servant girl looking over her shoulder. You possibly realise that given the natural arte element to this sculpture, it couldn't be done from the front because otherwise it would be regarded as straightforwardly pornographic. So we're now seeing the naturalisation of the classical urge as, of course, photography begins. And photography will affect all of the arts to the degree that Romanticism begins to come to an end. Towards the end of the 19th century, by the turn of the 20th century, is virtually over and is replaced in modernity by the sensibility which is now called modernism. But with the engine for this change, amongst many, many other complicated factors, is photography. In painting, it forces people not to reveal the nature around them, but to go inside the mind in relation to fantasy and dream and so forth, as firstly still and then moving photography, namely cinema, the art of the 20th century, takes over the realist and representational role in visual art. And similarly in sculpture, a turning away from the body and in towards a non-organic art of individual sensibility that doesn't relate to the society but purely the psychology of the artist, begins the trajectory which is called modernism. What we now see is a splitting away of the classical dispensation, and radical regimes, fascist and communist, are the only currents in the 20th century where the monumental and classicising tendencies of the last couple of centuries within the West are to be found. Even that is complicated and possibly should be the subject matter for another film. So this finishes off a relatively quick resume of English and British sculpture, stretching over several thousands of years. We've decided to end our film at the beginning of the 20th century, end of the 19th, and I've ended it here because the modernist sensibility then takes over. Personally, I believe you need another film about modernist sculpture, even modernist art, another 2 films maybe, because this sensibility is a total change and a revolution and a transformation in everything. So the classical tendency, the Christian, humanist and post-Christian tendency, the pre-Christian tendency, 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 years of work really comes to an end at the end of the 19th century, and the representation of the physical body, perfect and imperfect, then goes into film, into still photography, into moving photography, and then into mass cinema film, as well as elitist forms of artistic photography. Obviously, if you stop many classical films and freeze the frame, you actually both have a representational painting, but also at times a certain three-dimensionality to the piece, rather like Mantegna's Renaissance paintings, which are a combination of sculpture and painting. Now, if we look at the English and British tradition, you have examples like Bennes's bust of Queen Victoria, idealised from before her reign really begins. You have William Anderson's version of the Scottish laureate, or moral laureate, Burns, from 1854. You have, as we depicted earlier in the film, the version of Robert Southey, which exists in Bristol Cathedral and was completed by Bailey in 1845. And we have 2 famous sculptures which I would like to finish on, both for aesthetic and political reasons. These are the images of Sir Henry Havelock from 1861 and of General Sir Charles Napier in 1856. These were by sculptors such as George Adams. Now, both of these forms are very interesting because Ken Livingstone, the present Mayor of London when he was elected, wanted to tear them down, or at least remove them from Trafalgar Square, where they sit at the front of the square, often ignored in comparison to Nelson's Column, designed by Railton, with Bailey's sculpture at the top and Landseer's lions equidistant from the pillar. Now, many people, hundreds of thousands of people, will pass these sculptures of Havelock and Napier at the front of the square, going down into Northumberland Avenue, where the Ministry of Defence now is. and they will not know who these figures are. These figures are imperialists from the Indian Raj in the 19th century. One of them is responsible for putting down the Indian Mutiny with quite considerable bloodshed, and it's because a leftist like Livingstone, Mayor Livingstone, knows this, that he wanted these figures removed. He couldn't get them removed because his importance and alleged civic esteem as mayor doesn't extend to the appurtenances of Trafalgar Square. He's got no control over the statue in the square. He can ban the pigeons from the square or ban people feeding the pigeons, but he can't remove sculpture. So what he did to get his own back is he had the empty plinth at the far corner of the square, which is adjacent to the National Gallery behind it and looks across to the Canadian Embassy on the other side, and he used that for Turner Prize exhibit art, deliberately to get back at the authorities who denied the fact that he could remove Napier and Havelock from the front of the square. So in this talk about aesthetics and politics, we come full circle, because the high Victorian classical impulse exists in the central square, right at the heart of our post-imperial city, London, where we now have a sort of anti-British and unpatriotic mayor who wants to repudiate the imperial past which is in fact partly led, amongst many other factors, to London's multiracial present status. Nevertheless, the thing he wants to remove from the square is the symbolism of the past, is the way in which it classed itself, is its classification of itself, i.e. its classicism. So to end this film, I would ask people, when passing across the precincts of Trafalgar Square, to have a look at these rather strong, slightly dour, stolid pieces of English sculpture at the front of the square, depicting Havelock and Napier as imperial warriors and heroes in a subdued, classical manner. The images and reliefs and bulk masses that Livingstone wished to remove to some obscure place in Sheffield or Bolton where you would never see them again.